I did my presentation on Deborah Meyer's book, The Power of Their Ideas. Oh, it's a little distorted. I think it's going to be kind of ugly. I'm sorry, y'all. But to start off with, Deborah Meyer is a activist in education. She has been working now for 6 decades in the educational environment. She was born in New York City in 1931, which was a long time ago. She is very old. She went to Antioch College for 3 years and then got her bachelor's at the University of Chicago. She wasn't interested in being a teacher at all because in the book she wrote that it was a woman's job and she never wanted to have a woman's job. So she became a kindergarten teacher, and eventually she worked really well with this one superintendent, and he was like, hey, let's open a new school. And so she chartered Central Park East, which throughout the presentation I shortened it to CPE. So the first one she opened was in 1974. Over 12 years, she opened 3 more in the Central Park East line of schools. There's a middle school, a high school, an elementary school, and then another elementary school. And other schools also started following suit, and she went to these schools and became a consultant and helped them build a framework similar to her own. So, she moved to Boston in 1995 and also started working with other groups, and most recently she helped begin Mission Hill K-8 school. And then as of 2014, there are 50 schools in the country that operate in the same manner. So her personal ideology, she looks a lot to John Dewey and Piaget, but more so to Dewey. I know it's been a long time since we all took Foundations of Education. So just a quick refresh on that. His focus was mostly on the social interaction of the classroom. So he really focused on what he called the opportunity of experience. Deborah Meyer's focus was on the idea of the small school and how it can function in many ways that are much better than the way that our system has been working. She emphasized the need for small schools, and ideally she wanted no more than 200 students in the school, which is very small. I graduated in a class of 286 people. And I went to a small school in my head, so if all of our classes were 286 people, that was almost 1,000 kids, that's crazy. Anyway, no more than 400, ideally less than 2. She really was interested in the idea of project-based learning rather than rote memorization and just rows and columns of desks, and we'll get to that. She also really emphasized a strong community atmosphere, and wanted the decision-making within the school to be shared between teachers and not be a top-down deal where the school board is telling the principal what to do and the principal is telling the teachers what to do and the teachers are just directing the kids. She also really her main focus is making sure that democracy is infused in the classroom. She said famously that, to summarize what she said, how can students be expected to function effectively outside of schools if they don't experience the democratic system in schools? So that was her main focus in education. So this book poses a lot of questions throughout. And so for each chapter, I have a short answer to the question that chapter is asking us. So the first chapter wants to know the constraints that poverty and racism impose on the lives of children are real, but how could schools loosen rather than tighten them? Because we know that that's a thing. You watch the news and you can see that teachers still are inherently racist, and that's a thing that's happened, and teachers are still inherently classist, and that's a thing. And Deborah Meyer says that a school should value what every child is able to create on their own, and that they should explore everything on their own and make their own mark on their school. This means calling into question the idea of intelligence. So, we a lot of teachers are if they're not book smart, then they're not worth it. And we have to rethink that idea of what they're intelligent at. So that made me think about, I know we've all taken Dr. Gaynor's class, and we talked a lot about different intelligences. So like bodily kinetic intelligence in like your PE classrooms, and like musical rhythmic intelligence in your music classrooms, logical mathematicals, visual spatial. Those are just like the ones that I can remember off the top of my head. And those are things that like we as teachers need to learn to value within each individual student in order to try to loosen those constraints. And she says that without the diversity of people participating in that setting, like the democratic process can't continue without the diversity of those intelligences. So chapter 2 asks what was it that made Central Park East so successful. This chapter really focused on like the building of those schools. So she wrote that she wrote exactly what I've said. A lot of what she did to create the framework for these schools was focus on Dewey and Piaget. And she says in the book that she took a we versus they mentality, and that made all the difference in the relationship between the students and the teachers, as well as the students and the parent, or not the students and the parents, the teachers and the parents. They built their framework also on children's natural curiosity. They also wanted it to seem like a family relationship, like the community that she was striving for, and everything was very learner-centered. She wrote, there cannot be one right solution in the book. Similarly, in chapter 3, they talk about how to keep high school kids deeply absorbed in work as 5-year-olds are in their play, because we all know that like in high school, I honestly would have rather been anywhere else in the world than sitting in my trigonometry class. And it was, you get what I'm saying. So we keep them engaged by focusing on things like their natural curiosity and like making sure that the experience is learner-centered. So she writes on page 48 that in kindergarten we design rooms for real work and not passive listening. A good school is like a kindergarten classroom. She describes like walls. Kids have pictures on the walls that like show what they're learning, and it gives them a visual, and like the classroom is an enjoyable space. And she really emphasizes that that's how we need to keep acting and keep treating kids in order to keep them involved in the classroom, especially at an older age when they're learning things that they think they don't need to learn, which will continue on in another chapter. Teachers also, in order like to keep their morale high, teachers should communicate expectations of themselves and of their students back and forth. Like it's very important that the teacher is communicating back and forth with students. She writes that we should be respecting families, like the children's families and the children's communities and the children's culture. Because if we're not, as teachers, respecting children, we can't expect them to respect us or respect what we're trying to teach them. She also writes that we have to deal with issues that we don't want to deal with in order for students to stay connected and like stay involved. One example that she writes about is dealing with the issue of racism in the classroom. And it made me think about this last semester for methods, when you have to have like 400 something hours of observation. I went to Louisville High School, and I was observing this teacher, and every book that she had her class read was dealing with a real life issue. So one of the books that they read that I got to read with them, it was called All American Boys, and it was about police brutality in like larger cities. And it was very interesting because the demographic of her classroom was mostly black men, boys, and they were all in the 8th grade. And so most of them were very like, during one day we had discussion, and at every table the kids had very different reactions. And it was interesting there was one white boy in the class, and hearing the perspective of the other kids in the class really made him think, and you could like watch him experienced that, listening to the other black boys say, like, well, I had an experience, well, my cousin, well, this person, my dad, like, and so dealing with those issues in the classroom keeps, like, them focused on what you're, you know, do you get what I'm saying? Like,
Yes.
it's not, you have to deal with those issues in order for students to stay connected, not only in the classroom, but what's going on in the real world. And then it becomes interesting, and then they continue to work, just like 5-year-olds want to play.
Mm-hmm.
So in the 4th chapter, she addresses truths and myths about why a good universal public education seems impossible to people. She says that people expect an equitable and positive outcome no matter what. And that, like, people just think that the have-nots should never distract the haves, and that competition is more important than anything else. So parents worry about other people's kids too much, Meyer says. They're too focused on, like, well, that kid got a better scholarship, or that kid is better at baseball. And she addresses one myth that schools have become ineffective and are on the decline. Let me pull up the page. But she talks about a study that was done, wrong page, that researchers in 1993 from the Sandia National Laboratories, they started to, like, look into these things. After 2 years of research on nearly every measure, we found steady or slightly improving trends over the last 3 decades in schools, like, as far as test scores and stuff goes. I mean, as far back as, yes, thank you. As far as, like, any kind of, like, standardized material they have access to, right? So she also says, I think it's the page before, that the term dropout is new because most kids had never dropped in before the 1940s. So, like, realistically, this book was written in, like, 1985. So the people who were parents at the point that this was written were people who probably didn't finish high school if they were around, you know, like, or their grandparents didn't finish high school. These were people who, like, grew up during wartime, and most of those people didn't finish high school, especially men, but, you know, that's a whole big thing. So trends are improving, and that's a myth that she addresses. She also talks about how academia is an elitist concept. So, like, even I know that we do it because I do it. Like, people who are richer, you expect to have more access to education. I mean, because they do. Richer people have more access to education. But we, like, also, we see it as an elitist concept, but we also inherently think that urban schools are centers for more violence, and, like, you don't want kids to be at these schools, and, like, people assume that schooling is on the decline because of inner city schools that people, like, that you can get loan forgiveness to go teach at Peabody Middle School in Memphis, Tennessee, because it's an inner city school, and, you know, people don't want to work there because it's an inner city school. She talks about this, that people assume that these are violent places, but in reality, these are mainly havens for students from violence. Like, people who go to Peabody Middle School in Memphis, Tennessee, typically live around the Mound, and it's a dangerous area. Like, there's a lot of gang activity, and it's, like, inherently everybody is just like, okay, so if these kids are going to the school, then that means that it's dangerous, and truthfully, it's not. So in the 4th chapter, she also discusses how there's a large push to privatize schools, which I was also thinking about this while I was reading this. There's also a large push to privatize prisons, and it's interesting because people are very much against the privatization of prisons, but privatizing schools, people aren't so like, they don't speak up as much about not wanting to privatize schools. But they expect this to be beneficial to America. And on page 74, she says that at first, when the states heard about this, the government, like, came back and was like, okay, we're gonna have competency tests, we're going to raise teacher salaries,